here for Global Discontents. You're in the right place. And thanks for being here on this beautiful, sunny, Coast Salish day. My name is Irwin Oostindie, and I'm your moderator. And I'm also with Democracy North, which is cooperating on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. And we'll be broadcasting today's talk on cooperating on this Tuesday at 5 p.m. It'll also be broadcast on Red Eye on a Saturday morning in the coming month or so. So just heads up, be aware that what you say in public will be
held against
you in the future. I want to, something I actually try to avoid doing is territorial acknowledgements, because I think often territorial acknowledgements are have a liberal gesture that stands in for true work. But I think today's discussion is going to be a grounded conversation that acknowledges this genocidal moment, or post-genocidal or current genocidal period that we're in here in the occupied Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish, and other Coast Salish peoples. And we're doing this work, we're having a discussion about global discontents, but we're also going to be grounding in the local experiences as we understand them as accomplices in the liberation for these unceded lands. So with that, I want to welcome you. I also want to give acknowledgement to the Hari Sharma Foundation. I first, as a young person growing up here, in 1985, I first met Hari with the BC Organization to Fight Racism meeting in a church basin somewhere. I don't remember where it was, but it's gives me good feelings to know that the Hari Sharma Foundation is supporting this work, and also that Sansat is a co-presenter of the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy. And I wanted to ask Chin Banerjee, if you could maybe just say a couple of words at the microphone and maybe bring some connection to your work and also David's work.
Thank you, Irwin. No, I leave introducing David to you, because that's, I think, I mean, it's a long time. I'm going to be very, very brief. First of all, on behalf of South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, a warm welcome. And my heartfelt and deepest gratitude, thanks for Samir Gandesha and the Institute for the Humanities for being here, so that we can work together and do these critical things. South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, as the name suggests, is a bunch of South Asians. we are a group of South Asians in this area, British Columbia, though we have tentacles here and there as well. We promote secularism and democracy, by which we do not take ideologically, critically, because our main business is to spread critical awareness primarily in the South Asian community, but generally speaking, critical awareness, and therefore we take the notion of secularism and democracy also quite critically, subjected to criticism all the time, and look at it not simplistically, but in all its ramifications and complexities and so on. But critical awareness is primarily what we are concerned with, and therefore spreading discontent. So indeed, this is the right place to do. And I will leave you with that, and let our dear brother David, our star guest, whose star has risen ever since he got deported from India, from Indira Gandhi airport, where he had been when he was planning to go and interview Kashmiris, to human rights activists who had discovered thousands of unmarked graves in India-occupied Kashmir. And so, of course, for that reason, he was not even allowed to get off the airport, put on a plane and sent out, though he had been visiting India for 40 years, interviewing people, doing all kinds of work, but Kashmir is taboo. However, keep your eyes open. We are going to show you a film on Kashmir on April 14th. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So today we'll hear from David Barsamian, and we will then hear from Dionne Bunsha, Lindsay Brown, and Annie Ross, and then we'll hear from you. There's a microphone here that Shin just used, and you'll be able to ask your questions. We'll have some good discussion. I know there's some great thinkers in the room, so I'm looking forward to that discussion. David, as we just heard from Shin, is one of America's most tireless and wide-ranging investigative journalists. He's altered the independent media landscape, being a mentor for me and thousands of independent media workers across Turtle Island for years. He's broken ground both with his weekly radio show, Alternative Radio, now in its 32nd year, but also with his books with Noam Chomsky, Iqbal Ahmad, Howard Zinn, Tariq Ali, Richard Wolff, Arundhati Roy, and Edward Said. Of course, that says pretty much all there. We will leave it with David to share what he wants to do in terms of this broad-ranging book that is both representative of the struggle that we're in globally, and we'll also then bring it back here to the unceded lands here in British Columbia.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to be back in Vancouver. Special thanks to Sunsud, which is a remarkably unique organization that has stoked the fires of dissidence and opposition in a very principled way, I must say, and hats off to Chin Banerjee and other Sunsud members who are here. Thanks for all that you do. Vancouver is a special place for me. It was one of the first places, radio stations in the country that broadcast alternative radio starting in 1986, CFRO at 100.5 FM every Tuesday from, I think it's from noon to 1. You can hear alternative radio. You can hear dissident voices from the United States and from around the world, including recently an SFU professor, Bob Hackett, on the media and the environment. So always looking for diverse voices. And I kind of back away from using the term America, which is very imperial, and I'll just keep referring to the US as a US or USian. I'm going to hand out a sign-up sheet for you. If you didn't get a notice from Boulder about this event, then you're not on my mailing list. And if you could kindly just fill out your email, I'd be most appreciative. Don't worry about me sharing it with CSIS or the RCMP, because they already have all your information, so you're perfectly safe. But do write clearly. Remember, there's some people over 50 here that might remember penmanship. It's a great art, so please write carefully.
Not in a minute, I think we are.
All right, well, this is my 11th book, believe it or not, with Noam Chomsky, and I'm going to immodestly say it's the best one we've ever done, simply because having worked for so many years now, almost 35 years, more than that, when I first wrote to him was around 1980, and we did our first interview in 1984. I've learned, how to edit him very carefully so that the sentences are crisp and tight and meaningful, and not a kind of academic style where the the initial clause starts in Halifax and the sentence ends in Victoria, and you don't remember what was the subject of this anyway, because people in ivory towers tend to be a little bit verbose and loquacious and load up a lot of information. But I was just looking through my wallet here, coming across little Chomsky notes. This is not to impress you with how well prepared I am, but these are little snippets from Chomsky. The first step is to penetrate the clouds of deceit and distortion and learn the truth about the world, then to organize and act to change it. And there, I think, a vibrant media system is absolutely essential for the functioning of a democratic society. As Thomas Jefferson said, an informed democracy can act in judicious ways, but an uninformed one will deliver the kinds of people that you've seen elected or selected in the United States of America. I'm going to try vigilantly not to use his name. So when I refer to the exalted leader or the great one, I'm not talking about Kim Jong-un, okay? I'm talking about the 45th president of the United States, who is arguably, I don't think it's even have to make a case. I mean, the happiest man in the United States today is George W. Bush. Why? Prior to the ascendance or descendants of the current occupant of the Oval Office, the most unpopular and most loathed and despised U.S. president was George W. Bush. Well, now he's been one-upped by the current occupant of the White House. And you may ask yourself, well, how could this happen in the world's second largest democracy? And I think, we need to place the exalted leader in the context of what's been happening around the world post-neoliberalism, when there has been a rise of autocrats, xenophobic nationalists, that's almost an oxymoron, misogynists, and predatory capitalists, such as Narendra Modi in India, such as Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, such as Andrzej Duda in Poland, Viktor Orban in Hungary. The new head of state in Austria was elected on a neo-fascist ticket. That's Sebastian Kurz. So in state after state, country after country, Duterte in the Philippines, and I'm leaving out Sisi, of course, in Egypt. These are all very close allies, by the way, and supported by the United States through a network of military bases and agreements to prop up these regimes. So I think this is what Chomsky would say is a direct outgrowth of neoliberalism, this economic doctrine which was promoted initially by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The first thing Reagan did when he became president of the United States was to smash a union. 11,000 air traffic controllers were laid off, and the American, to the disgrace of the American labor movement, they did not stand up for their fellow workers who lost their jobs under that particular regime. At about the same time, Maggie Thatcher was smashing unions in England, and it's been a downward spiral for working people in many, many countries who have seen their wages stagnate, who have seen their benefits disappear. Something like a pension now in the United States is considered very exotic. Like what century did you grow up in? Talking about pensions and paid sick leave and maternity leave and paternity leave and all of these things that were part of the social safety net of Western countries. I can't speak about Canada with any authority, but certainly in the United States they have been greatly eroded. And so this created this stagnant wages, the concentration of wealth in the hands of just a few people, 1/10 of 1%, had huge social and political consequences. And when a charlatan comes along and is very skillful at scapegoating and laying the blame for your problems and your difficulties on the backs of immigrants, Muslims, Mexicans, uppity women, gays, lesbians, you see why and how someone like the great leader is currently occupying the White House. It is a kind of a white-topia that is being projected out of Washington, D.C. And Chomsky says, another little note here, you cannot control your own population by force, but it can be distracted by consumption. And I would say also distracted by the corporate media, which is very adept at focusing on important issues like the Kardashians in the United States and their latest foible or enhancement or divorce or scandal or whatever. this kind of that's why I call the media a weapon of mass distraction. You know, this particular T-shirt says, resist the corporate media. You know, don't trust the corporate media. But I think you can trust the corporate media in one respect. They will support the existing power structures of the state. They will support U.S. imperialism. They will support predatory capitalism. They will support the attack, looting, and plunder of our mother, which is going on right in front of our faces. And Canada has a big part of this, that is to say, the destruction of the environment. With all of the mining companies that you have headquartered here, with the pipeline that's being proposed by the US-owned Kinder Morgan in British Columbia, you have a lot to do here in terms of defending our mother. We are committing terroricide at this moment. And Chomsky says over and over again in this book and elsewhere that the two major crises facing humanity, not just US, North American people, but humanity, is the war on nature, the destruction of the environment, and the threat of extermination through nuclear war. And so when you have, again, an occupant in the White House who is so bellicose, who is so aggressive, who so flaunts American imperial power and in-your-face kind of, obnoxious behavior, these are very dangerous times. I remember clearly the Vietnam period in the 60s and 70s when we had then an out-of-control president, Richard M. Nixon. But I think this is much more dangerous for a variety of reasons. So you don't see, one of the popular programs in the US is housewives, Desperate Housewives. You never see, housewives from Baghdad or Isfahan or Ankara. You just see, housewives from privileged U.S. communities like Malibu and, the Hamptons on Long Island and the like. And Chomsky says, the cynicism is justified. The response should not be apathy, but constructive action. And I think this speaks to one of his favorite phrases, one of mine, and Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmed, and that is Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. You look at what's in front of us objectively and see the danger, but not cower in front of that danger or not surrender to it, but resist. And this is, I think, a very critical time, particularly in the United States, and there have been various resistance movements that have sprung up, such as Black Lives Matter, other community groups, 350.org on environmental issues has been very prominent. And so at a moment of danger, citizens need to step up, not walk away, not say, hey, I'm too busy, or I've got this or that thing going on, and a second job, and I'm paying off my child's student loan, and I really don't have time to get involved. It's so critical that there be community involvement here, locally and nationally, and of course in the United States. The standard technique of privatization is to defund things so that they don't work, and then people get angry about that, and then you hand it over to private capital. This is the formula for privatization. Maybe you're familiar with it here in Canada. You starve agencies for funds, then they don't perform properly. Children don't do well in school scores because teachers aren't being paid properly, schools are not being funded, budgets being drained of money, and then you turn it over to the private sector and say, look, we tried, it's failed, it's time to move on. And we're seeing this again, all over the US, and I call this kind of market fundamentalism, a kind of mystical belief that the market, which is, we should speak in plain English, predatory capitalism with its werewolf hunger for profits, as Marx said, Groucho, the other one, the political one. And if you think that, as the US often does, as the leadership, when I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about the ruling class. I'm not talking necessarily about the American people, have been largely hoodwinked. It's as Chomsky says, historical amnesia is dangerous not only because it undermines moral and intellectual integrity, but it lays the groundwork for future crimes. And so when our great leader talks about America first, because he is afflicted with historical amnesia, because he is extraordinarily ignorant of US history, he does not realize that America first was the name of a fascist party, a neo-Nazi party in the United States, led by Charles Lindbergh in the 1930s and 1940s. So that's one way of making certainly America first. Pulling out of the Paris Accords, the environmental agreement that was signed by over 190 nations. There were a couple of states that did not initially sign on. One was Nicaragua, incidentally. Why? They thought it was too weak, that its provisions should have been much more aggressive, should have been much more militant in terms of punishing states that were pumping fossil fuel into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming and to climate change. The other state that didn't initially sign was Syria, which is war-ravaged, destroyed, bifurcated in multiple pieces because of a lack of any kind of central government and leadership. They couldn't sign. They didn't sign on originally, but now they are on that particular agreement as well. So the U.S. is number one. We are isolated from the rest of the world when it comes to climate change. We believe it's a hoax, according to our great leader, invented by the Chinese in order to undermine U.S. authority and prestige. So, again, propaganda to be effective has to not just have a blunt hammer in its hand, it has to use language, and here again, a particular area of Chomsky's expertise, language to manipulate and control the public mind. So when you attack a country, when the U.S. invades a country, shall I name a few? Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Mali, Niger. The permanent war on terror has now extended to West Africa with no end in sight anywhere. The Afghan war is the longest war. In fact, I don't even like to use the term war because it's not like a war. It's an invasion, occupation, with a hugely disproportionate amount of casualties on one side versus the other side. I leave it to your imagination as to who experiences the greater number of wounded and killed. The military machine that straddles the earth, sometimes supported by Canada, as in the Libya operation. That was a great success for Canadian diplomacy as well as other NATO states, destroying Libya. It is now basically in three parts, each controlled by various jihadi groups, and will be very difficult, like Syria, to reconstruct a coherent society. But this is, part and parcel of U.S. imperial global policy. Militarism, predatory capitalism, the capture and domination of resources, and the capture and domination of people's minds. That's crucial, a crucial part of this, because if you're going to get the American people to support these imperial wars, you have to indoctrinate them, and you have to instill fear into them that, they're under attack. The Mexicans are coming. We need walls to protect ourselves. We need more and more arms. A week hardly goes by when there isn't some major killing in the United States. The most recent one was about 10 days ago, actually on Valentine's Day. How ironic, when all these kids were killed in Florida. And my mind went back to the Sandy Hook massacre. And I thought, this is a turning point. This is the elementary school in Connecticut where 26 people were killed, 20 of them first graders and 6 teachers. And I said, this surely will roll back the power of the NRA, the National Rifle Association. There's no way they can withstand this. Not only did they withstand it, they went on to enable more pro-gun legislation. The Gallup poll had a couple of years ago, did an international poll listing the countries that people thought were the most dangerous and most threatening. Far and away, the United States was in the lead. The second country was Pakistan, probably inflated by the India vote. It's hard to know, but that's a possibility. So I've been thinking quite a bit about and speaking about the relationship between the US as this external violent actor and the US as a country where there's an enormous amount of internal violence as well. And what is that connection between the use of violence? And of course, I have to thank the great leader in some respects, because before, when I used to talk about white supremacy or misogyny or patriarchy, I'd have to explain to most US audiences, what these things were. But now it's become so prevalent that, and it's become part of the discourse. So in that sense, it's a little bit healthy. Now, pulling out of the Paris Accords, an absolute disaster. Nullifying the agreement with Iran is another example of how the US is acting as a rogue state in total defiance of international law and Security Council resolutions. Incidentally, the term international community and international law, according to Chomsky, these are terms of propaganda. The international community, if we are to define it as we should, consists of the United States and those countries that go along with the US. That's the international community. If not, then you're part of the rogue community of states. And international law is to be applied to designated enemies, like North Korea, like Syria, like Iran. It does not apply to the world's second largest democracy, and it certainly doesn't apply to Israel and other states that are yoked to Washington. Now, I think, what Chomsky keeps hammering about over and over again is that these are institutional problems inside the United States. These are not about individuals. It's very easy, and I've done it a little bit, to go off on the great leader and say, how terrible he is, and these, crypto-fascists and the like. But there are reasons that the barrel keeps producing these kinds of rotten apples. But the focus is only on the rotten apples, not on the institutions that produce them. And I would contend that that barrel is what is producing over and over again militancy, aggression, imperialism, and predatory capitalism at home. The Iran deal, now we have to be objective here, as Chomsky would say, it did have problems, major problems. First and foremost, it was working. If Iran was in compliance with all of the conditions that the IAEA, the Vienna-based UN agency, had applied to it. It had sent not 1, not 2, not 3, but 8 inspection teams to Iran, and they came back with a report card that was A+, that there was no violations, there was total compliance. This so roiled and so upset our great leader that he dispatched someone who may be even more ignominious than he, but the bar is very high, and that is to say the U.S. ambassador to the UN, the former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, who went to Vienna, who tried to persuade the IAEA officials that Iran, in fact, was in violation, was doing all kinds of shenanigans, in secret caves, deeply hidden underneath mountains, and the like, but she came back with nothing. because there is nothing there. And she's been pretty quiet ever since, although just a week ago there was almost an orchestrated show and tell. Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, held up a piece of metal saying this is from an Iranian missile that was fired on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, a great US ally, in case you didn't know, very democratic, leader in human rights, women's rights, just off the charts. Certainly a model country in the 21st century. And at the same time as Netanyahu was waving a piece of metal, apparently there was another piece of metal that Nikki Haley got and said this is proof positive of Iranian treachery. So, U.S. foreign policy goes back to the Kennan document of 1948. We're a small percentage of the world's population, but we consume 50% of the world's resources. And it is the order, it is the trajectory of U.S. policy, no matter who is in the White House, to maintain that disparity. Of course, the numbers have changed now a little bit in terms of the proportion of U.S. population to the rest of the world, and the consumption of natural resources is down to 30%, but it's still enormous. And that has been the overlying goal of U.S. foreign policy. There's a lot more to say, about language, how language influences thought. Let me give you just another example, because again, we're talking about the great leader. In defiance of international law, UN Security Council resolutions, and world opinion, the United States of America is moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is, again, an America First policy. And I just learned today that Sheldon Adelson, who's a major billionaire backer of the great leader, an extreme right-winger who's made his money in Las Vegas casinos, is willing to pay for the move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as quickly as possible. And that speaks to the role of lobbies in the U.S., small groups that are able to have enormous influence. I mentioned the National Rifle Association. There is a pro-Israeli lobby in the United States, which is very, very strong, has a great impact on policy. There is a Cuban lobby that has historically been very, very strong, again, in defiance of international opinion and international law. These are topics that Chomsky keeps coming back to, about the need for law and respect for law, and then using terms. Are we running out of time? Almost, yes. We're almost running out of time. This is a coffee crisp. We'll be having that. But it's interesting, I'm in a position of denouncing capitalism, but then resorting to capitalism in telling you that I've got copies of this book here that I'd love for you to get and I'll sign. Or a book on tape, the whole book is on CDs, as well as 4 brand new alternative radio programs like its greatest hits, including Jason Stanley, who was recorded at Trent University in Peterborough. Brilliant talk on how fascism works, something that we really need to understand in the US as that drift towards fascism accelerates. I don't want to overstate it. I don't think we're at the point of Dachau and Buchenwald and Auschwitz, but I think it's really an urgent time to engage and to get involved and not look away and not pretend that we are not in great danger. David K. Johnston did a program, I have to say his name because it's in the program, Trump, the Age of Mendacity. Nancy McLean, brilliant American US scholar who teaches in North Carolina. She has discovered the roots of right-wing power. And it's not just the Koch brothers. It goes back to someone named James McGill Buchanan, who kind of formulated the notion of extreme libertarianism as intersecting with an authoritarian state. And of course, very pro-corporate. Mussolini, who founded the first fascist party in 1915, one of his definitions of fascism was, in fact, that it was the close interaction and intersection of state and corporate power. And I think we see that playing out. One of the interesting aspects, and I promise I will wind up momentarily, one of the interesting aspects of what's going on today with Modi, with Erdogan, with Duterte, with the great leader that we have, and Orban and Duda and the others, they've all come to power through the ballot box. These are elected demagogues or selected demagogues. And again, I think that speaks to a tremendous amount of disempowerment, cynicism of voters. Someone once described the results of the 2016 election, by the way, in which one candidate got 3 million fewer votes than the other candidate. When I was in Jordan and Armenia in the last few months, people were asking me, how is this possible? What kind of system do you have in the United States? You know, here, if you get, more votes than the other person, you win. You're the winner. Yeah. But not in your country. What's that about? Well, again, a little history is a dangerous thing. And since we live in the USA, in the United States, and of amnesia, we don't realize that this antediluvian, retrograde electoral college system is directly connected to slavery. Because when the US was formed in the 1780s, the southern states had a very sparse population. And they were going to allocate political power according to population. And so the African American slaves were counted as 3/5 human. So I guess if you had 3 slaves, that would be 1 full human or a human and a half, in order to give the South more political power. It was to placate the slave owners in the South to create this electoral college. And now we have this absurd situation where 2, not 1, 2 of the last 5 presidential elections in the United States have been decided by candidates who got fewer votes than the losing candidate, Bush in 2000 and the great leader in 2016. Chomsky points all of these things out, all of the contradictions, all of the hypocrisies about making the world safe for democracy. It's really about making it safe for corporate capitalism, for embedding US military bases around the world, creating this archipelago of bases, stretching from Okinawa and Taiwan all the way now around into Eastern and Central Europe. So as Noam would say, there's a lot of work to be done. This is no time for idleness or cynicism or being passive. It's time for activism. Thank you.